Some 24 years after the release of Aliens, the Alien Blu-ray set release enabled fans to finally read the crew dossiers that appeared behind Ripley during the inquest in the film. This provided a wealth of information, most of which was in-jokes never meant to be seen on screen, and indeed was never seen on screen. The dates mentioned throughout don't match the dates mentioned in the film. Ripley says Burt contacted Hadley's Hope on 6/12/79. Using American dates, this is understood to be June the 12th, 2179. Travel time from Earth to LV-426 is 3 weeks, so there's no major time lag in the film. Remember, Newt isn't years older when they find her than when we see her earlier with her parents and brother. With Ripley being adrift for 57 years, Alien takes place in 2122. The date of the Nostromo's last departure, according to the dossiers, is 2/17/34, or 17 February 2134, presumably. So you can see the discrepancy. First up is Dennis Munro Parker. We can see that the Nostromo's registration and tonnage both correlate with the first film. The last point of departure listed is LNB-14. This could easily be the registry number for Thetis, mentioned by Dallas in Alien. Similarly, LV-426 was supposed to be called Acheron in Aliens, though this was never mentioned on screen. The return journey to Earth transited through the Solomon CT. The Solomon's reference is sourced from Alien, though it was intended to be the Solomon Islands on Earth, as earlier drafts had Houston instead. CT is mentioned here and there in later entries like Ripley's, and according to my old mate Darryl Curtis of Nostromo Files fame, is very likely Circuit. I thought maybe it might be Communications Terminal, or Control Tower perhaps. Connecticut? No, Circuit actually makes the most sense. Prior to flying to LNB-14, the Nostromo departed a place called Delos. This is possibly the name of the Greek island, the supposed birthplace of Apollo and Athena, and further referencing Greek mythology as Acheron does. Further down, Delos has NB appended to it. Again, I don't think that's New Brunswick. The travel time from Delos to LNB-14 is over 7.5 years, so possibly not the Greek island. I'm assuming ERT is Earth relative time. Before Delos, Parker was at Eta Draconis, some 92 light years from Earth. This journey took approximately 8 months. Some digits are missing from Parker's entry but can be found on Brett's. By contrast, the Nostromo was to take 10 months from Zeta 2 Reticuli to Earth, a distance of 39 light years. 2 more months for less than half the distance. Faster spaceships? Less traffic? You be the judge. The previous trip out was a return trip to Caput Trianguli, also known as Alpha Trianguli, which is about 63 light years away. This was around 13 months there and 11 months back. His first trip on the Nostromo appears to have been from Titan Dry Dock 14 to Gateway, which took a bit over 6 months, presumably at sublight speeds from the moon of Saturn. He spent over 3 years on the USCS Terminator, a reference to James Cameron's first film, not counting Piranha 2, and this is the first in-joke. The Terminator flight was from Beta Lyrae, 960 light years away. If starship speeds are more or less consistent with the Nostromo at this time, such a journey would take about 21 years. His previous employer before Weyland-Yutani was Pacific Western Corporation. This is a reference to Galen Hurd's production company, which was merged with Valhalla Motion Pictures in 2000. Parker's ship before the Terminator was the Delaney, only guessing that this refers to science fiction author Samuel Delany. Decades later, Delaney would appear on James Cameron's Story of Science Fiction TV series. I can't find any obvious reference for Hewell Garrett Polytechnic School, on Mars no less. However, the term polytechnic isn't overly common in the United States, perhaps suggesting that the dossiers were written by a British crew member, or someone more familiar with the British education system, or possibly they were more popular in Canada, where James Cameron hails from, and a former British colony. It may also very obliquely tie into Roger Corman's films, as Corman is where Galen Hurd, James Cameron and Bill Paxton all got their start. Isabel Jewell and Roger Garrett appear in Corman movies in the early 1970s. It's pretty weak, but there you go. Milius Public School, with a CH, is likely a reference to filmmaker John Milius. Parker's remarks say that he is intelligent, but suppresses it to better fit in. His IQ was boosted slightly thanks to the drug Dramox 222, but when his performance was judged to be still below average, it was suggested his Dramox dosage be increased. The events of Alien, however, put paid to that. The Lucan Miller name doesn't have any obvious connection to anything that I can find. There is a place in Ontario called Lucan, about 2.5 hours from where James Cameron grew up in Chippewa, but no place nearby called Miller. There were a few Millers in the cast and crew of The Terminator, along with Miller Drake, who was set to direct Piranha 2 before he got fired and replaced by Cameron. Miller Drake would also later work on visual effects for Cameron's 1989 film The Abyss. An even weaker connection could go back to the town of Lucan, the home of the Donnelly Massacre of 1880. One of the foremost experts of the so-called Black Donnellys was the author Orlo Miller. How this connects to James Cameron, or even if it does, is anyone's guess. All the entries mention how many miles have been travelled with the acronym MTD. The aforementioned Darryl and I tried to work this out some time ago, but could never settle on what it stood for. The numbers vary wildly, in the billions to just double digits. Miles to date, mean or maximum travelled distance, neither of these really fit. Some entries also feature references to up mode, that is, transits without resorting to hypersleep or faster than light travel. Brett's service history on the Terminator and Nostromo are the same as Parker's. Before that, he was on the USCS Hurd, the aforementioned Gale Ann, working for the American Gothic Company. This refers to James Cameron's production company, American Gothic Productions LLC, which was registered in 1983 and had an office at 1800 Century Park East in Los Angeles, about a mile from the 20th Century Fox studio backlot. Samuel Bronston refers to the producer of such epics as King of Kings and El Cid. There is no Hawks or Lula in West Virginia, but I'm guessing the former could be referring to Howard Hawks, the famed director of such classics as Rio Bravo and The Big Sleep, and the producer of The Thing from Another World. The Lula reference has eluded me. Brett's background reveals a violent childhood and criminal activity that led to the company employing him as part of a rehab program. The Steiner-Korngold analysis refers to Max Steiner and Eric Korngold, film composers and contemporaries primarily in the 1930s and 1940s. Kane's entry contains some very obvious references in the form of the USCS Giga and USCS Ridley. One of Kane's trips was to GBH 45, likely another meaningless planet designation a la LV-426, with the most common meaning being grievous bodily harm, which is what he suffered in the first film, to be fair. The references to Delos in Kane's entry also tell us that it is not the Greek island, as it wouldn't take nearly 2 years to travel there from Gateway. Gateway is in itself out of place, as Ripley wakes up in the film saying she doesn't recognise the station, which makes it strange that it was a major company spaceport 57 years earlier. Kane also works on the USCS Guyler, David Guyler, Brandywine producer, and the UKCS Powell, referring to Evil Powell, Ridley Scott's associate producer on Alien and Blade Runner. On the Powell, which he captained, he worked for the Smith-Wisher Corporation. Wisher is a reference to William Wisher Jr., who co-wrote The Terminator and Terminator 2. Smith is harder to pin down, but may refer to Donna Smith, who was the production manager on The Terminator, and the first name on screen when the credits start. It might also refer to Guy Smith or Dan Smith, both of whom worked on Battle Beyond the Stars, with Dan in the same special effects department with James Cameron. And it may also be Dick Smith, who Cameron wanted to do special effects on Terminator. Smith turned it down, but recommended Stan Winston. On the Guyler, Kane was employed by Hill Transport Company, referencing producer Walter Hill. The UKMS Outreach actually sounds like a legitimate attempt at a name rather than an in-joke, the MS prefix presumably being medical ship for the United Kingdom Socialist Medical Authority Colonial Bureau, possibly poking fun at the NHS. The names Bryce, Watkins, Gunning and Weatherly all appear in the credits for Alien, as does probably the most prominent, concept designer Chris Foss. Kane is presented as an overachiever who struggles to focus and ends up abusing the drug dilochronium when he tries to compensate. It induces an embolism while he's at medical school, and he ultimately retrains as a commercial pilot, but is considered too idealistic and impulsive for full command. Man Hadley isn't a reference to anything I've been able to find. Ditto Hunter Selman. However, Selway Digression Molecule Binders refers to Mary Selway, who handled UK casting for both Alien and Aliens, along with a million other movies. And of course, Hadley is used again for the colony in the film. Interesting to note that Kane is listed as the oldest member of the crew by a fair margin. In reality, Brett was the oldest, followed by Dallas, Parker, Kane, Ripley and Lambert. Perhaps it was to do with hypersleep, though Kane hasn't spent significantly more time in hypersleep than his crewmates. The characters' ages, Kane aside, are more or less in line with the ages of the actors when Alien was made. There are some odd dates in Kane's education, however, where he attended Weatherly and Gunning Foss at the same time, then a 6-year gap, presumably attending medical school, which he doesn't complete. He then goes on to do a Masters of Engineering and gets a pilot's licence, and we can assume up to 7 years on the Outreach, doing 9 transits between 2103 and 2110. Lambert has a similar recent record to Parker and Brett on the Nostromo, and prior to that was navigator on the USCS Cameron, someone clearly sucking up to the boss. She was also on the USCS Thetis. The latter here is curious, as that was the Nostromo's last port of call before the film, where Ash joined the crew. Instead, the dossiers continue to reference LNB-14. Probably the most famous bit of info about Lambert is that she was born male and then went through a Despin conversion to female. The way this reads is that it was not something that Lambert was able to consent to. Unlike a child who is born intersex, or having both male and female traits, and the parents make a choice to raise the child as one gender or another, it seems as if Lambert's parents wanted a girl, so had him converted to a her at birth. Trauma stemming for this is a known quantity, yet Lambert appears to be unaffected. This aspect of Lambert has never been discussed by either Ridley Scott, Dan O'Bannon, David Giler, Walter Hill, or Veronica Cartwright, so it would appear to be something created solely for Aliens. A film that already had jokes about Vasquez being mistaken for a man and Frost having sex with a male Arcturian by mistake. It's unlikely it was included to appear progressive, considering the less than friendly climate around the gay community in the 1980s, especially when you look at the full context and Lambert's lack of consent. Ultimately, though, it may just be a nod to O'Bannon and Shusette's note for their original screenplay, indicating the roles could be male or female. And on top of all this, we have to remember that none of the information in these dossiers ends up on screen in the film, and therefore not supposed to be given this level of scrutiny, especially decades after the fact. As for the name Despin, for years I've pronounced it just like that, Despin. However, while researching this and finding very little information, it may very well be D-spin, and I've just been saying it wrong the whole time. D-spin means to stop the rotation of or reduce the speed of rotation of something such as a satellite. More broadly, to stop something going the way it's supposed to, such as changing the gender of an infant. Lambert attends Carroll High School in Gordon, Arkansas, name-checking the producer Gordon Carroll, or maybe Lawrence Gordon, who was president of Fox between 1984 and 1986. And supporting the earlier guess about Samuel Delaney is a reference to Robert Heinlein, though James Cameron's well-documented inspiration from Heinlein's Starship Troopers, and the very name Heinlein being more unique, makes it more obvious. The Frakes Stephen orientation refers to Randall Frakes, who made the short film Xenogenesis with Cameron in 1978. The Stephen part is a little more difficult to pin down, but is possibly Stephen Barncard, who did effects lighting and props on Battle Beyond the Stars with Cameron and Frakes doing effects photography. Battle Beyond the Stars also included Alec Guinness and Dennis and Robert Skotak, who all went on to work on Aliens. Lambert is otherwise described as being slightly hyperactive and nervous, treated by a drug called Loxiclav M. Not found a link to this, however, amoxiclav, or amoxicillin clavulanic acid, is a widespread antibiotic first approved for use in the US in 1984. Lambert is also described as not overly social and better off in small crews who spend most of their time asleep rather than awake. Both Lambert and Ash's entries misspell USCS as OSCS for the Nostromo. This itself is a misspelling of the original USCSS. Ash's dossier contains predictably little other than to tell us that he's a science officer grade M1 and has been operational for 4 years, possibly a nod to the 4-year lifespan of the replicants in Blade Runner. His data is classified due to the scientific nature of his previous assignments, which suggests he's been doing this shifty special order thing for a while. Dallas again has much the same record as Parker and Brett, indicating he's shipped out with them a number of times before. Prior to working for Weyland-Yutani, he shipped out on the USCS Annabelle, named after Richard Annabelle, who produced the Alien photo novel. His employer was Seymour Cobb Genetics Corporation, named for the Alien production designer Michael Seymour and concept artist Ron Cobb. Before that, he was on the USCS Shusett, referencing Alien co-writer and executive producer Ronald Shusett. His employer at this time launched 1,000 canon and shared universe arguments for those unable to grasp in-jokes and Easter eggs, Tyrell Corporation. And to be fair, it might have actually fit at the time, setting aside the fact that Alien and Blade Runner had separate owners. Decades of development on both franchises, however, have put the kibosh on that, with faster-than-light travel not being discovered till much later in the Alien universe, and Tyrell Corporation going under about 70 years before Dallas was born. This hasn't stopped endless clickbait articles or fan theories, however. Dallas' schooling is also full of in-jokes. Alien publicists Charles Lippincott and Stanley Bilecki, creature effects designer Carlo Rambaldi, and writer/creator of the Alien, Dan O'Bannon. One curious note is Dallas isn't his surname according to this dossier. His full name is Dallas Koblenz Arthur. So assuming this isn't a typo, and there are plenty of those, everyone in the first film is calling him by his first name. And that's also how the company identifies him. Contrasting Dallas's very obvious references, Ripley's are a bit more obscure. She serves on the USCS Youngblood Hawk, a 1962 novel by Herman Wouk, which was adapted into a film in 1964, starring Suzanne Pleshette. What's the connection? I've not been able to find one beyond the aforementioned Max Steiner doing the soundtrack, which I don't think really counts. Maybe it was one of Cameron's favourite films back in 1985, or Herds, or whoever wrote the dossiers, which I've also not been able to find. Before this, Ripley was on the US merchant marine vessel Zelazny, named for the author Roger Zelazny. Ripley's School of Brea Olinda is named after James Cameron's high school in California. The Boyer Private School is harder to pin down. The only very tenuous link is Nathan Boyer, aka William Fitzgerald, who went over Niagara Falls in a barrel in 1961, which is only a couple of kilometres from where James Cameron grew up in Chippewa, Ontario. The Brea Olinda thing perhaps points to Cameron himself writing these dossiers, as he was not a particularly big name at this point, and there was no internet to research this kind of thing. Was his ego big enough to put his own name as a ship name? Wouldn't surprise me. Cameron himself has said, however, that all he did with Ripley's backstory was to call her Ellen and give her a child, which suggests that this was not his work. An interesting note about her daughter's birth: it would appear that Amanda was born around February 24, 2128, during Ripley's assignment on the Zelazny. However, she broke company bylaws even before being employed by the company, it would seem. She left Amanda when she was around 18 months old, travelled to Pluto, then to LNB-14 where she arrived in October 2133. The return date of LNB-14 for all the crew is referenced as February 17, 2134. Judging from Ripley's record, it should have taken approximately 3 years to get back to Earth. So if they got back in 2137, that would make Amanda 9 years old, rather than 11 as Ripley states in Aliens. However, while there is a continuity glitch here, albeit that's not actually on screen, Ripley's record does reference her joining the Nostromo crew at LMB-14, the same as Ash, even though that piece of dialogue was actually cut from Alien. Ripley is described as having a high IQ and high performance levels expected to reach a top rank. The Dylan Donovan reference could refer to the musicians Donovan and Bob Dylan. How that connects to Aliens, I have no idea. Cy Melchior, who was surveilling Ripley, might be a reference to the Roger Corman-produced Death Race 2000. The original story, The Racer, was written by Ib Melchior and featured Sylvester Stallone before he cracked the big time with Rocky. So I haven't been able to pin down every single reference here, but I think we have most of them. Bits of these dossiers made it into the original Alien DVD extras created by Charles de Lozerica in a way that actually properly fits with the Alien universe and kept with the Joseph Conrad references for starship names as established with the Nostromo and continued with Sulaco. It was these DVD crew bios that we used during the time I did continuity consulting with 20th Century Fox on such books as the Weyland-Yutani Report by S.D. Perry and the Alien Isolation novel by Keith DeCandido. I think it's fairly obvious why the Aliens dossiers weren't used.